we're going to pick up where we left off last week, and so I'll give a brief recap of what we were looking at. So, starting here, we're looking at, and we'll continue this through next week before we move on, but the idea is that God still has plans for Israel. And we could look at dozens of passages, both in the Old or New Testament, to make this point. But I went with probably the most, I think I would even call it the key prophetic passage within the Bible, because it sort of sets a skeleton for which definitely all of the New Testament prophecy is concerned. And when you think about the New Testament writers, their idea of what the end times would look like was shaped by the Old Testament. And so when they're writing passages like 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 or 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 with Paul, Jude gets into a little bit, Peter gets into a little bit about talking about the end times. And certainly if and when we look at the boy, brain freeze. The time when Jesus talked about the end times, the discourse. My brain is freezing up. The Olivetic Mount.
Olivetic discourse. Yeah.
Is that what it's called? That doesn't sound right.
Discourse?
Well, it sounds familiar, but I don't know. It didn't fit the context.
Man, it doesn't sound right. Maybe that's why I was stuck. Anyway, Jesus talked about the end times and we're going to look at it even on Sunday morning next spring. But all of that tied back into the Old Testaments, and certainly there's other passages, key passages like Ezekiel and Zechariah is just a wealth of information about both the time of Jesus and the end times as far as prophecy is concerned. But nothing quite does it as much as Daniel. Daniel gives most of the information. So when we're looking at this passage, think about it. I mean, we'll look at, we're only going to look at 3 verses, yet you're going to look at, say, how are you getting any realistic information from these verses? But these are the passages that the New Testament writers had, and this is the passages that they built on. So when we look at these verses, understand that they had 400 or 500 years to reflect on these things and come up with opinions and ideas about how they would develop. And similar to us today, people disagree about exactly how that's going to happen. So there was a lot when Jesus came and clarified and expanded upon the prophecies of Daniel. It was very eye-opening to these people. And then as the Holy Spirit came and indwelt the New Testament church, and Paul started teaching, and Peter wrote in his epistles, and John with the book of Revelation, was all expanding upon this stuff that they were looking at. So it may seem thin when we look at it, but keep in mind, this is what all of the New Testament prophetic passages are tied on. So we talked a little bit. I'm going to jump through. I want to catch you up on what we looked at last week. So we looked at the nation of Israel in captivity in Babylon, and we talked about why they were there, because there was a disobedience regarding the people of Israel giving the land of Israel its proper rest like God commanded. And so because of that, God had told them if they wouldn't give the land the rest, that he would take the nation of Israel out of the land so the land could get his rest. Because that is not, we argue about Palestine and Israel and who owns the land and so forth. That's God's land, and he declared it from the very beginning, and he gave it to Israel to use, but he still considers it his land. So when the nation of Israel disrespects his land, he takes it seriously. So he moved them out of the land for 70 years, and so then he gave that land its rest. And that because the land was supposed to rest every 7 years, and they were moved into captivity for 70 years, that meant that we're looking at a 490-year window that in which this punishment was relevant. And that's important because we're going to look at another 490-year window in the prophecy that we're moving on to. So we started with Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 last week. A period of 70 sets of 7. And we talked about how those 70 sets of 7, if you have 7 of anything, these, and you multiply that by 70, you're going to have 490. And so just like that 490-year window was in view at the start of the Daniel chapter 9, when Daniel was reflecting back on Jeremiah's prophecy that the people would be out of the land for 70 years. And Daniel realized, hey, that time is almost up. And he had expectations about how God was going to reestablish the nation of Israel. Because remember, for 67 years, from Daniel's perspective, the nation of Israel didn't exist. It was wiped out. And so the prophecies talked about the Messiah reigning from Jerusalem, and that the nations of the world would revolve around the city of Jerusalem. Yet Jerusalem was wiped out and the temple was destroyed. And so Daniel had this idea that the Messiah was going to come back and reestablish the nation of Israel, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and gather his people back, and then set up the kingdom. And so the angel Gabriel came and said, hey, I've been sent from heaven with different plans, with a prophecy, but it's not like what you think it is. You were looking at a 490-year window that had just closed, but instead there's another 490-year window that's about to open. And so that's how Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 starts up. And so it talks about a 70 sets of 7, and at the end of those 490 years, we're going to see the Jewish people are going to finish their rebellion against God and against what his plans, because they were continually fighting against him, to put an end to their sin, to their apostasy, to their rebellion, to their following other gods, to cling to Jesus as their God, to atone for their guilt. So to make to finish that as well, to bring in everlasting righteousness. So now we're moving past the nation of Israel and moving forward. Thank you, Ron. And we're moving just from viewing the nation of Israel. Now we're going to expand to the bigger picture of the entire world, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, to wrap up in everything that's been prophesied. It's all done now, and it's been confirmed. Everything's happened exactly like Jesus said, or like God said it would through his various revelation, and to anoint the most holy place, to finally set up the temple as it was designed to be that perfect and holy place that nobody defiles, and that it's the place where God lives. Remember, initially, the Spirit of God came and lived in the temple, and not, we could talk about the spiritual and biblical consequences or things about how that could be and so forth. But let's move past that for the moment. The temple is seen as God's holy place, as his place of his dwelling. And if you look ahead to Revelation chapter 22, you find that throughout eternity, so spoiler alert, I know a lot of people think that you're going to spend eternity in heaven. And you have these grand ideas about what heaven is and what it's going to be like to live in heaven through eternity. If you think that way, I'd encourage you to read. Just skip ahead to the end. I encourage you to do that just once. Revelation chapter 21 and 22, and read what eternity is really going to look like. Because eternity isn't about us spending eternity in heaven. It's about God coming and dwelling for eternity on the new earth that he created. And it talks about him living within the temple. And so that future temple is going to be God's dwelling place. Now, does that mean we're going to be restricted to the earth and we're going to be confined here similar to like we are now? No, we're going to have God, the universe is going to be our playground, so to speak. We're going to have bodies that are going to be able to do that. And there might still be a place for heaven. Heaven's like a spiritual thing where Revelation shares that our eternity is going to be not as misty, incorporeal, ghost-like beings. We're going to have physical bodies. We're not going to have angels, and we're not going to be sitting on clouds playing harps and all that stuff. God has actual plans for us, and they're really exciting plans, and we're given a small, tiny glimpse of them in Revelation. But anything we can imagine, God's plans are going to be infinitely more perfect for them. So going back to this verse now, I want to point out the fact that these things that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, haven't all taken place yet. We see, if we look at the nation of Israel right now, we see for the most part an apostate nation, a nation that does not believe fully in their God. Other than the United States, the nation of Israel has the highest amount of sexual sin, of secular living. They're one of the most cosmopolitan. I don't know if that word has a meaning anymore. They're the most worldly society in the world. You think about the United States and all of the filth and the garbage we export to the world. Israel has embraced that. They're like United States East, because they're not really. I mean, we think about, oh man, if I went to Israel, boy, it would be really comfortable, as everybody would be believing in God and everything. And no, that's not it at all. But that's going to happen one day, and the Bible talks about that. But I want to point out, I want to probably get back, and I've taken too many rabbit trails this morning. My point here is to say these 6 things haven't taken place yet. So that 490-year period, whatever that 490-year period is, it's not at its end. It's not someplace in the past. And that 490 years is not fully taken place, because when we know that, because we can see that these things still are not, these things are still not answered. So when we're looking at these 490 years, we want to be looking at some part of it being still to take place yet. So let's look at how these 490 years break out. So we looked at verse 24 in detail last week. So the 490-year, we just talked about this. So let's move on to verse 25. So listen and understand, 70 sets of 7, or 7 sets of 7, plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the anointed one, or some translations actually say the Messiah, the Prince, comes. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times. So we looked a little bit in detail. I'll just briefly do it again. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. So those are 69 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, or to rebuild Jerusalem. And then, so we'll focus on that first part. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses. Again, other translations, I don't know why I picked the NLT, because I don't like the way this was translated here. But they will be built with streets, strong defenses, walls, so forth, despite the perilous times. So again, we talked about last week, those of you who have been around when we went through Nehemiah and saw the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the walls and stuff, we know that they were several times during the rebuilding of that, they were attacked. And so it was very perilous, because those walls weren't built, and the people surrounding Jerusalem did not want those walls to be built, because once they were, then they would have defenses against the people that surrounded them. So they were attacked several times while they were rebuilding the walls, to the point where the people who were working on the walls worked one hand with the hammer or whatever carrying, and they always had like a spear in the other hand, or something that was within grabbing distance, because in a moment's notice they needed to be ready to defend themselves. And so we saw that. So it talks about the 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. You'll get different opinions on this, on what that breakdown actually means. I believe that the 7 sets of 7 were the time that Nehemiah came back and actually established the walls and got Jerusalem built back up to the point where it was supposed to be. And that command, it was given in history. We know what day of history that command was given to go and rebuild those walls by Cyrus, the Persian, the leader of the Persian Empire at that time. Don't want to get too much into history, but I want to help you understand this, because so much of this is key. So we see that 7 sets of 7. Now we see a 62 sets of 7. And I believe that simply is the period of time between when the Jerusalem was finished getting rebuilt and the Messiah came. And that I believe that specifically. So Jesus lived, debatable. Some people will say 30. Some people will say 33. I've heard as high as 36 years old, or even a little bit higher, a lifespan of that year. So when exactly would we be talking about here when he comes? Well, so now we're talking about specifically the Messiah coming. So remember, for long periods of Jesus's ministry, Jesus would say stuff like, he would do a miracle and say, don't tell anybody, keep it. Or somebody would say, you're the Messiah. And he would say, oh, keep it to yourself. Because there was a time period where he was to publicly reveal his messiahhood to the nation of Israel, specifically to the people in Jerusalem, where the spiritual leaders were. Notice that through most of Jesus' ministry, he didn't go into the temple area and say, your Messiah is here, come to me. He didn't. He tried to teach Old Testament principles that pointed to him, but he didn't specifically declare his messiahhood until what? You guys tell me. When did he officially declare his messiahhood?
He was in Capernaum, and he got up and he read the Isaiah passage.
No. Good guess, but no. That was him trying to reveal that fact. Yes, he wanted to. But when did he publicly declare himself? Your Messiah is here. There we go. Palm Sunday. He came riding in on a donkey into Jerusalem, just like it was prophesied in the Old Testament. And that was his saying, the Messiah is here. Yet, a week later, what happened? He was killed. And fortunately for us, he was also resurrected. So we're talking about that time frame happening here. So the 490 years, 483 year window of the 490 year window, and that's the 69 sets of 7. I want to be clear, because that's what we're talking about in this verse. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. So 69 sets of 7, or 483 years. That window started when the command went out to rebuild the walls, and it ended when Jesus came into his messiahhood, when he came in and declared himself, I'm the Messiah. That's the window we're talking about here. So now we're going to pick up in verse 26. Oh, okay. So I pointed out last week, this was the connection of that decree of, and I said Cyrus rather, but it was Artaxerxes who made that command. There's the dates, and this is the book where I got all this information from. So if you're interested in more about that 483 year period, I would recommend this book by Harold Hoehner. There's a Kindle version. It's not a heavy read. It's a really light read, but it does talk about the time of his birth and where you could put that on our modern day calendar, the time of his death and where you could put that. And then it also talks about this prophecy. So it is a pretty interesting book if you geek out to that level of detail, which I do. Some of you guys would be bored by it completely, but so we pointed out last week, we ended on this, that because we see the 483 years being fulfilled, that we can see that God's prophecies can be trusted. God's prophecies are fulfilled literally. And if the first 483 years were fulfilled literally, then we should expect the last 7 years to be fulfilled literally as well. Now remember, we talked about in the beginning that 490-year period could not have been completed yet, because the things that it said would happen when those 490 years were complete haven't been completed yet. So that last 7 years, wherever it is in history, it can't be following consecutively that first 483 year period. And you say, okay, so I've heard it said that the reason why you think that there is some gap period between the 483 third year and the 484th year, the people who believe there's a gap there believe that only because that's what their prophetic beliefs insist on. If you didn't have a belief that there's a gap there, you would never insert that gap there. And my answer is okay, if you're saying the 490 years are completely fulfilled, then where is the fulfillment of those prophecies? So you'll see people go through lots of gyrations to say, okay, well, when it says that, an end to the sin will take place, then what it really is saying is, Jesus paid the penalty for sin, And when it says it'll bring an everlasting righteousness, so it'll go through all kinds of gyrations to try to say all of those things have been fulfilled. What I'm going to show you today is the gap is actually taught within in this passage. And if you see it that way, you'll see the teaching is there. And once you see it, I think you really can't unsee it. So I said all that to say this. I'm building up to verse 26 here, because it's going to talk about the next part there. So we got to Jesus, the Messiah, the Prince, presenting himself. And then what happens next? So after this period of 62 sets of 7, the anointed one will be killed. So we know that. We've seen that. The anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing. So if you were not a follower of Jesus, and this is the Jewish people to this day, think about it. These are the when you talk about Jewish rabbis and people who follow the Judaism, the followers of Judaism, they believe this, that you say Jesus is the Messiah, but he was killed and nothing changed. Where is the kingdom? If Jesus was the Messiah, where's the kingdom? Where is the promises that the Messiah was supposed to fulfill when he came? They're not happened. Jesus wasn't the Messiah. None of those promises occurred, right? So the anointed one, the Messiah, will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing. The interesting thing about this to me is the Jewish people were taught in this passage that they're supposed to have revered and supposed to be part of their holy scriptures, that the Messiah would be cut off. The other translations say cut off, but if you look at the root words of these things in Hebrews, that word cut off is typically used for the purpose of killing. He appeared to have accomplished nothing. So these prophetic verses are in their scripture, yet they refuse to see it. As a matter of fact, if you talk to a lot of Jewish people that are heavily Jewish, what they will tell you is that they've been told not to look at these passages. That the problem is Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27 is so deep spiritually that the average follower of God cannot understand them. And it's only for the rabbis to look at these passages. So they're told, if they go to the rabbi and say, I'm reading through these verses and it doesn't make sense, it looks like it's teaching something here. And they say, oh, you're not supposed to look at that. That's a sin to look at that. So they actually have verses in their scriptures where it's a sin for them to read it. Now, does that make any sense other than people who are trying to avoid some truth that God is trying to tell them? And so it's very interesting, that fact. So let's go back to this verse here. So the anointed one, the Messiah, will be killed, appearing to accomplish nothing. And then we see after that, so this is where we would expect, okay, here's where the 484th year will start. Because we talked about the first 483 years, Jesus came, and the Messiah came, and he was killed. So, okay, so the next 484th year should start then, right? Well, what does it say next? And a ruler who will arise, whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. And a ruler will arise, whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. So the next thing we see is the destruction of Israel. Well, but wait a second. Our history books tell us that the temple and the city, Jerusalem, was destroyed in 70 AD. But Jesus, there's a lot of argument about what year Jesus was killed. But I have never heard anybody argue that it was 69 AD. Most people argue that's 33, 32, 30. I've heard somebody argue as high as 36, AD 36. I've never heard anybody argue AD 39. And it's ridiculous because we can look back in history and we know exactly when the Apostle Paul was killed. We know exactly when Peter was killed. And that was like AD 64, AD 65. So we know for sure that that was dozens of years before Jesus' time. So yet this passage teaches that the next thing we see after the death of the Messiah should be the destruction of the city and the temple. But that happened in 70 AD. So there's a gap. There is a gap. So people who say there's no gap between the 483rd year and the 484th year, history itself will tell us there's a gap there. That the Messiah was killed, and then some ruler arose, and we know from history it was Titus of Rome, who later became an emperor after his father. It's interesting, his father, I want to say Domitian, but I know that's not right. His father and Titus came to attack Israel, and during that time frame where they were moving to attack to destroy Israel, and specifically Jerusalem, there was something happened in Rome itself, and Titus's father went back and was declared emperor at that point. So Titus stayed, and he was the one who actually destroyed Israel. He later succeeded his father as emperor, and so he became emperor at some point as well. So that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
In the 60s, Nero.
No, but it was,
But
yeah.
Domitian was.
Domitian, or
Yeah.
Domitian, yeah.
In the 80s, 90s, or Paul.
Right.
Not
So
Paul, I mean,
I'm trying to think who was Titus's father. I had his name in my head last night and it jumped out. But in any case, what's important is that this ruler Titus, who will arise, whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. The end will come with the flood. So it's interesting that Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, writes about this period where Jerusalem was destroyed. And if you remember how Herod, if you remember that Herod was the one who rebuilt the second temple, the temple that was standing at the time of Jesus, he wanted to sort of get on Israel's good side. So one thing that he did is he put a lot of money into the temple, trying to earn the Jewish people's loyalty, and he filled the temple with gold, and it was in golden covered walls, and all the decorations were gold. Well, so when the Roman soldiers came and attacked and destroyed Jerusalem, soldiers aren't typically paid a lot of money, but one perk they have is they get the spoils. The plunder, yes. And so when they're looking through Jerusalem and gold, and they come to this temple and see all this gold on the wall, well, they're trying to pull it off. But the problem is some of it was hard to get off. And so what they decided to do is set the temple on fire, and so the gold would melt, and then they would be able to get the gold, and as it was melting, and then it would harden, and they'd have gold, nuggets or whatever. Now the interesting thing is the gold that was melting ran into the cracks of the bricks that built the temple and temple wall. And so they actually, in order to get all of the gold, they wanted to make sure they got every bit of gold. So they actually tore the walls down so that they could get into the gold, which fulfilled a prophecy that Jesus made early in his ministry, where he said that this temple will be torn down and no two bricks will stay on top of one another, because they so wanted that gold that they tore everything down to get to it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered, because they're soldiers. Why would they care about destroying a building, right? They don't care. But because they wanted to get that gold, they destroyed the temple completely, which was God's plan. Sean.
Vespasian.
Okay, thank you, Vespasian, or Vespasian, however you pronounce his name. Yeah, that was the guy who came. He was the general that Titus was, and Titus's father. He came to destroy Israel. He got called back to Rome because of a political thing going on, and he ended up getting appointed as the emperor at that time. Okay, so the end will come with the flood. So the reason why the flood happened is the temple was set on fire initially, and so they had to put it out with a flood of water to make sure that things weren't consumed, rather than getting what they wanted. And the wars and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. So what that is pointing to is, I believe, so you'll get different opinions, but what I believe this is talking about is the post Israel after the destruction. That they for 1900 years roughly after that fact, after the destruction, they were a people, set adrift, and they had other wars. It's a little known fact among Christians, but 70 AD was not actually the end of the Jewish nation. They still had a couple more attempts to gain freedom from Rome. The actual real date is 135 AD, when the last Jewish rebellion was finally crushed, and they never rose up as a united people after that. So maybe it's talking about that. I'm not really dogmatic about that. It's not really germane to what I want you guys to understand, which is this gap period that we talk about between the 483rd year and the 484th year is actually taught within Daniel, because we see it, because we know roughly when Jesus died, and we know pretty absolutely when the destruction of Jerusalem. So we see that there's anywhere from a 35 to 40 year gap in between those two events itself, and we still haven't gotten to that last 7 year period. So let's take a look at that last 7 year period. Okay. So we talked about the walls being destroyed, the rocks, one wall on top of another. So there's a picture in modern day Israel where some of these rocks still stand. They were just sort of thrown there, and nobody ever bothered to move them. So you could go and see those to that day. Because of Jesus, the rejection of Jesus as Messiah, God, sorry about that. I think I jimmied this cable. God pressed pause on his plans for Israel and turns his attention to building his church. So I'm proposing to you, this is why the gap is taking place. So Jesus rode in as the Messiah. He presented himself, and they gave thumbs down to him. And they decided, no, he's not the Messiah. As a matter of fact, we can't have somebody running around claiming to be the Messiah. So he's got to die. And so he was killed. And because of that, well, God wasn't very happy about that. So what he decided to do is, I'm going to turn in my plans. I'm not, as some people say, I'm not abandoning my promises to Israel, but they clearly have rejected me. So I'm going to put pause on them, and I'm going to turn my eyes to the Gentile nations to our benefit. All of it. I don't know, maybe some of you might have Jewish heritage, but for the most of us, the reason why we get that benefit is because, or the benefit of being followers of Christ is because the church, God's current focus is on building his church. Jerusalem has been destroyed at this time, but the Jewish people were scattered, and no Jewish nation existed afterwards. And there's still 7 years of prophecy left for the Jewish nation, but no nation exists for it to be fulfilled. Israel must be reestablished before that fulfillment could take place. So we had 7 years take place. The nation of Israel doesn't exist. But it must come back because God still has plans for them. And so let's look at maybe the most key prophetic verse in all of Scripture, because it really talks about what's, for us at least. So the one we should care about the most, because it sort of lays out a skeleton for which the book of Revelation is really built on. So let's sort of dig into this. And once we get finished with this, we'll be done. I know I've gone over a little bit of what I want to stop at some period of time. But I think we'll end our time with the discussion of this verse, because I think it's so key. So he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. So that's the first part. So we know it's sometime in the future, because again, we already talked about why it's in the future. He is going to make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. So if we go backwards to verse 26, the last person that was in focus was this coming prince, or this coming leader, ruler, that was going to destroy the nation of Israel. So many people, most pre-millennial people, will say that this he is the future Antichrist, which is, okay, boy, I got to go backwards, because I skipped over something sort of major, sorry. And a ruler who arise, whose armies, okay, bad translation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing on who the he is, although there is a lot of argument, so I'm just going to point out to you the different factions, and then I'm going to go forth with my faction, because I could spend 25 more minutes here trying to convince you that the he refers to the Antichrist. I will tell you that some people believe that the he refers to the Messiah. And so those are the people that believe that the last 7 years happened right after the first 483-year period. Or some people argue that the period where the Messiah, the prince, was presented was the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And so if you believe it from that way, they believe that the he here is Jesus making a firm covenant with many. But I'm going to teach what is traditionally the traditional pre-millennial viewpoint of this verse. If you want an amillennial viewpoint of this passage, I suggest you go elsewhere. If I had infinite amount of time in this class, I would certainly present that as so you guys could make your own opinion, but I don't. And so I want to teach what I believe is the correct thing rather than giving you a lot of what I believe are false things and then give you the true thing. I'd rather focus on what I believe is the true thing. Now, just because I believe it's true doesn't make it true, and you're free to search for other opinions, but I can only do so much here. And what I'm going to do in the last few minutes is teach what I believe. So I believe that this is teaching that he, the Antichrist, will make a firm covenant with many. Now, again, what does many mean? A lot of debate about that. The consensus is the nation of Israel, although people will say it could be the many nations, in other words, the Gentile nations. In any case, he will make a firm covenant, or often it says the firm covenant. It's so funny. This verse is so literally broken down by people talking about it that there are so many different opinions almost on every major word in this verse. And so understand, I'm not going to be able to present every single thing, even if I took the rest of this class to do so. So again, I'm going to teach my thing, but I will point out that people also debate whether it's making a new covenant or confirming an existing covenant, which seems to be a very popular opinion right now, is that what this is really saying is he will come and confirm a covenant with many, a pre-existing peace treaty or other type of treaty or other type of agreement. He's going to come and make it stronger. So that's a valid translation of what this is saying. But the Messiah is going to or the Antichrist is going to come and either establish an agreement or confirm an existing agreement, make stronger an existing agreement with many, either the Jewish people or the Jewish people plus other people for 1 week. So that last week that we're talking about, this is that last week. But in the middle of the week, so about 3.5 years, if we're looking at these as 7-year weeks, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering. So because of this, it suggests that the temple is going to be rebuilt and that Jewish sacrifices are going to be reinstituted. So there's other ways to read this. And I certainly, again, if I had a lot of time, I'd tell you about other ways that people read this. But again, the majority opinion for premillennialists. Now, notice I'm not saying pre-tribulationalists, because that means the people that believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. When I say premillennialists, I mean people who believe that the millennium comes before the kingdom. In other words, they believe in a 7-year tribulation, independent of when the church is raptured from it. And so it's pretty consistently held that the temple is going to be rebuilt at some point so that the Antichrist can come and establish an agreement, and then later he's going to put a stop to the sacrifices and offerings. This leads to many people believing that the covenant he's going to make is going to be with regards to the nation of Israel rebuilding its temple. And so that's what how a lot of people read this. That's not necessarily the right and only interpretation, but that is a popular interpretation of what this verse is saying. And so that's why when Christians especially, when they hear about news about the Temple Mount and possibilities of right now it's a Muslim holy site as well, and they've been given control over it through a very weird process we won't talk about. But so it's within Jerusalem, but it's Muslim controlled right now. But people get excited whenever there's a possibility that the temple is talked about. And so you'll see a lot of excitement about that. And what that means is if that's getting closer to happening, then this whole passage might be getting closer to happening, which means that this 7-year period, which a lot of people, again, premillennialists will call the tribulation period, that's a popular term. I like to call it the 70th week of Daniel because it more clearly marks what the Bible has to say. So this is still a 7-year period that's out there in the future. And we see that in the middle of that period, there's going to be, the Antichrist is going to come and stop the sacrifices and the offerings. If you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about Antiochus Epiphanes and him coming in and desecrating the temple. That's what we believe is going to happen here as well. When it says here, in the abomination of desolation, that term, abomination of desolation, was used when Antiochus Epiphanes came into the Jewish temple and desecrated it. And so you might think that, well, that's what this passage is referring to then. Except Jesus, when he talked on in the Olivet Discourse, that was the term I was looking at before. When he taught the Olivetic Discourse, he talked about the abomination of desolation still being in the future. And so we see it in the 7-year period, and that is when because somebody would come in and defile the temple, it would no longer be suitable for offerings anymore. So that's where you see the common theory of the tribulation being that the Antichrist is going to rise and make a covenant with the nation of Israel, and that he's going to appear to be buddy-buddy with them. And as a matter of fact, some people believe that the Jewish people will actually mistake the Antichrist for the Messiah. And they realize he's not the Messiah when he goes in and sits down in the temple and asks to be worshipped as God. We see that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It's taught that the Antichrist will go into the temple and demand to be worshipped. At that point, he's desecrated the temple. The abomination of desolation has occurred, and the temple can no longer have sacrifices continue because it is now unclean, and God would not accept any sacrifice. And then, so we'll be on a wing of the temple. So that's debated. I'm not going to go into that because I don't really feel it's too interesting. Until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. So again, when we get into 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, in about a month, we will see this talked about again, specifically about the Antichrist. And so the Apostle Paul links back to this verse specifically when he's talking about the future Antichrist is to come, which is why popular pre-millennialism has this viewpoint that here's the last 7-year period. Antichrist comes, sets up a covenant or confirms a covenant with the nation of Israel. In the midpoint, he declares himself to be God and desolates the temple. And at the end of the 7-year period, he's destroyed. And if you read Revelation in the New Testament, we see that after the destruction of the Antichrist in Revelation, that's when Jesus comes back for the second coming and sets up his kingdom. And so I've just backdoored the entire tribulation overview skeleton into our teaching this morning. That's why people believe what they believe about the tribulation, is taking verses from the Old Testament, New Testament, and laying it on top of this verse and coming up with that. So I know I apologize for going so far over. We're still got about 10 minutes left. So here's where we're going to stop today, is at that verse. Okay, so here's a little graphic illustration of this. Covenant, desecration at the midpoint, and then Christ's second coming will end this last 7 years. And those 6 things we looked at in verse 24 about the 6 things that will happen at the end of the 70th year, we can agree that when Jesus comes back, all of those things will be fulfilled. And again, if I had 2 hours, I would go back and tie all this stuff together in a nice, neat bow. I'm hoping that this is enough to at least get you guys into the book, reading it yourself, tying it in with other things, or going to other teachings. Like I've recommended before, Andy Wood. He does a really good job on teaching on Daniel. Go to the YouTube and go to search Andy Wood, Book of Daniel. He has a whole series on it. He teaches through this in meticulous detail. If any of this sparks your interest at all. Okay. I thought I had some slides there, but they're all blank. So that's God's will. Questions, comments, discussion? Let's do it. We got 10 minutes.
I have, in a book that I finished in August, we talked about Ron Rhodes' chronological.
Yes, very good book.
And times there, his view states that the Ezekiel 38-39 war.
So If you're going to talk, okay,
I'm not gonna talk about it.
okay, good, because we're going to talk about that next
It's
week.
a summary, it's a skeleton
Okay.
you just did.
Okay.
So that, which Israel survives
Mhm.
there. And then after that, he says that's when the covenant
Yes.
occurs with the Antichrist through the United States of Europe. This is the way he called it.
Yeah.
That's his words for it. United States of Europe
Yes.
there. And then
Right.
that's where we get into this.
So we'll talk. We are going to look at the Ezekiel 38, 39. So a lot of you may not even know what that means. There's a future war prophesied in the book of Ezekiel, and we know it's future because we can look at the participants and know that that's never happened in human history. So we know it's still upcoming. We'll look at that in detail next week, and we will share that opinion among many others' opinions about what that war actually signifies. Marianne.
So that's kind of my question was like, what do you, why do you think that the covenant with many is with Israel? Or with the Jews?
So, because there is in Daniel chapter 11, there's a verse also that talks about the many. That phrase is used again. That phrase is only used twice, and the second time it's used, it's specifically talking about Israel. And so this is what I got. I got this from Andy Woods. He points out, he ties those two together and says because those are the only place where that phrase is used, that's the same thing. So I won't.
Same words?
I'm not dogmatic about that. I believe that it could be many nations. I could easily believe it would be the entire Gentile world. So I'm not really locked into the fact that the many is talking specifically about Israel. But one thing I'm pretty sure about is no matter what the many represents, it will include Israel. So go ahead. You had something else you wanted to say.
Well, I was gonna say, I understand that I think it's, and this is just me.
Yeah.
Off topic.
Everybody has an opinion on
It's
this.
going to
So-
actually have an impact on Israel. But just like now, like if that Antichrist would come and make a covenant with Lebanon and Jordan, all these surrounding countries that directly are bordered, so that they could live in peace and security, which has to happen before the other thing happens, then
Well-
that kind of makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah, I guess I missed part of the main point of Ron Rhodes in that is that Israel survived, his opinion is that Israel survives that Ezekiel 38, 39 war with this league that we'll talk about of nations that doesn't exist at this point in time. And he makes a protective covenant with the Antichrist. That they will come to the aid of Israel.
You say he, the Antichrist.
He, the Antichrist, will come to the aid of Israel should this Ezekiel 38 coalition try to attack Israel again, thereby establishing a peaceful. That's one among many used.
Yeah.
But that's,
So again, the number of opinions on exactly how this will transpire, I could easily fill up the whole semester just talking about different people's opinions on how different things are going to turn out. I would encourage you less to think about and be dogmatic about the particulars of how something will develop, because I have prophecy teachers that I absolutely think are exactly on point. Several of them, and they all disagree on various points. And so the worst thing you can do about the end time stuff is be too dogmatic about how something is going to end up playing out. And I think we can see that from Jesus' first coming, where his first coming didn't play out like anybody thought it would. So, Marianne.
I was just going to say, I said, just because it makes sense to us, God doesn't always work in ways
Right.
that make sense to us.
Right. So what we do is we'll look at the things that are definitely talked about for sure, and then we can try to infer things, but we got to be careful that, God, we haven't been, given thus saith the Lord type revelation. So we accept other people's opinions, with the love and respect that we have for each other. So
which gate is Jesus supposed to come riding through?
The
in
east
triumph?
gate.
And that's currently blocked, right?
It's currently blocked, and they actually what Sue was talking about is there's a prophecy that when Jesus comes back, he's going to land on the Mount of Olives, and he's going to come down. You have to sort of know the geography. There's Jerusalem's here, and from my perspective, I guess from here, the east, Mount of Olives is here to the east, and then there's a valley here, and it's called the Kidron Valley. And the prophecy is that Jesus is, when he sets foot on the Mount of Olives, is actually going to split north to south, and there's actually going to be another valley there, but that Jesus will come back and come in through the city through the eastern gate. And because the Muslim people know that prophecy, they built graveyards in front of not only is the gate been sealed so it cannot be opened, but they've actually built graveyards before the gate, because there's a Jewish belief that if somebody walks through a graveyard, they're defiled. Well, got news for you: the Messiah Jesus will not have any restrictions on him. You know, he literally could float over the graveyard if he wanted to. So that won't. Yeah, Jose.
Quick question. You had mentioned earlier that temple is partly controlled by the dome.
The Temple Mount. It's called the Temple area where it is. Yeah.
And so, do you see a scenario where the leaders in Israel or Netanyahu or whatever just say, "Nah, we're coming in. We're taking over"?
Well, the exciting thing about prophecy right now is that it's sort of starting to take place for the first time in a long period of time. Jewish people are openly going up there and visibly praying, as opposed to beforehand. Prayer has been restricted on the Temple Mount unless you're a Muslim. But recently, Jewish leaders have openly been praying up there, and you see the sense that this is becoming more and more an issue. As a matter of fact, a lot of people tie the attack last October 7th, that where Gaza invaded Israel. The Muslim people themselves claim that one of the reasons why they did that is they believe that the Jewish nation was getting prepared to take back control over that area of land, and their fear is that they're going to wipe out the Muslim temple, the mosque, and the Dome of the Rock, and they're going to reestablish the Jewish temple there. And if I had time, I would talk about the red heifer ashes and all that stuff. Those of you who know what I'm talking about will just nod your head, and the rest, you can ignore it. We might talk about it at some point, but it is very interesting that right now in human history, there is a lot of movement as far as getting ready to rebuild the Jewish temple, which is why a lot of people think we're really close. Shel.
Yeah, they are hoping that maybe one of those missiles fired that accidentally hit the Dome of the Rock.
Yes, that's a very popular prayer. Is that one of those missiles that Lebanon or Iran shoots will go off course and land right and just blow up the Jewish temple and destroy those things.
Yeah, even in government, we start talking about it, and then Ben-Gvir even mentioned, let's build a synagogue on that place.
Yeah.
They actually very close to that.
Plus they have all the stuff ready to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, you know.
It's ready to
Will
go.
they find themselves in a scenario where a Muslim country will say, "No, we're going to stop that"?
No,
So-
actually,
They blow it up.
opposite, yes.
Yeah.
Saudi, we very wanna proclaim it's not really holy for us. It's more Mecca, and we wanna actually, as soon everything developed, we wanna let Jewish to build. It's very cooking down there.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about this more next week when we talk about the Ezekiel 38-39 war, because my opinion is that war will lead into the rebuilding of the temple. And so now again, there's several different opinions on this war, and we'll go over that. But a lot of people believe that's either happen either at the very beginning of the tribulation or right before the beginning of the tribulation. And so we'll discuss that a little bit more next week, specifically about the temple. Okay, it's noon, so we're out of time. I really apologize for going over. I really did want to get all this material in today. I want to cover the Ezekiel 38-39 war next week, and then we're going to move into the New Testament, and we're going to specifically start focusing on the rapture a bit. I do think that, especially with this conversation with the tribulation, a lot of what I have to say on the topic of the tribulation and this stuff, we talked about during the Revelation teaching that Matt and I did last summer, and it is up on our church website and on our church YouTube account. So if you want to get more of my specific opinion and Matt's opinion, you can go up there and listen to us in further detail. And there's a lot of other good teachers out there that teach on it as well. So it's been very brief this morning, and I apologize for that. But it's just the nature of this class that Jeff has stuck a gun to my head and said, you have 4 months to finish everything you want to teach. And I would take me 2 years to teach everything I want to teach. So I'm trying to cram everything in, and you're the victims of that, which I apologize for. So let me pray and we can get out of here. Heavenly Father, I'm so thankful and appreciative of the word you've given us and the fact that we can see fulfilled prophecy throughout history and know that the future prophecies that have not yet taken place will be fulfilled in the same manner. And so, Lord, you're the God of history and the God of revealing what's to come before it happens, Lord. And I just so thankful that we have a God like that is in complete control over everything. And I just pray that we might take this knowledge and be good witnesses of it to the people we know. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you again for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Somebody I know was the doctor, and he said, I got you.
Thank you. You too.
You can't get out of the chair. You gotta sit down.
Find me when you're
Okay.
packed up.
Yeah. And then you drive over and we'll just load it in. Okay, sounds good, Sean.
Yeah. I like that crane move.
You okay, Ron?
You too, right?
You okay? You grimaced. I saw a grimace of pain on your head.
All right. Part of, yeah.
Just part of being old.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Boy, that trip really was a reminder of the limitations of getting old.
I honestly don't like spending the night anywhere but our house, just because it's painful, and I'm 20 years younger than you, so I don't
Well,
know.
this train, trying to sleep on the train trip would have been just,
Oh, okay. Well, I do record the week, so if you're interested in hearing it afterwards, let me know and I'll send you a link to the website.
Or what about one like that?
Hey, see you, Al. I think Mary,
Yeah.
oh my goodness.
I'm sorry. That sounds horrible.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to do
it was
it.
an experience.
you bought the train trip?
Huh?
Your train trip?
Hey, Dick, thank
He
you.
was talking about he doesn't like to sleep anywhere except his own bed.
Oh, yeah,
And
I
I
know your
said,
own
well,
bed's
he
the
said,
best.
oh my goodness, this
Sleep
would
on
have
a
been.
train.
I think Mary Ann should talk to her son Jeff about extending beyond 4 months.
Why me?
Good luck.
Because you're the mom, he said
He's
that
never done
once.
anything
Well,
I've ever
Kurt
told
never
him to
listened to
do.
anybody.
Unfortunately, Kurt supported Jeff's decision, so
Oh, well, maybe some of us should say so.
Well, then you can just start a private one. You'll still get a lot of people to show up.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm gonna do this on my own. Okay,
I
I'll come
shouldn't
to your
blame
house.
Jeff. That's unfair for me to do that.
I gotta find out where the registration cards